Hello, team players. So, this week I was going to cover Starfinder 2e field test content, but I just got my first Tier 3 patron, otherwise known as a team manager. So that means it's time for my very first specific build request. Okay, so the request is for a fleshwarp witch with the resentment as a patron. And for our heritage, we're going to be going with the Talos heritage. There's one Talos feat that's going to help us with our offense, and one that's going to help us with our defense. At least in certain situations anyway. The starting stats for this build should be Strength 16, Dexterity 10, Constitution 12, Intelligence 16, Wisdom 10, and Charisma 14. The Resentment Patron will give us the Evil Eye Hex Cantrip and the Enfeeble Spell, both of which allow us to debuff foes. Also, if our familiar is within 15 feet of an opponent when we cast or sustain a Hex, our familiar prolongs the effect of a debuff on that opponent by 1 round. This can be any debuff, including ones that were applied by our allies. However, this only works on debuffs that have a timed duration, and this doesn't prevent the debuff from being removed by other means. In other words, if the debuff lasts until they make a saving throw, this does not work. And their allies can still use spells and other effects to remove the condition. As a witch, we don't get a class feat at level 1. However, for our ancestry feat, we're going to be taking Startling Appearance. Our charisma is going to be pretty good, and this will give us guaranteed training in intimidation. It will also give us the Intimidating Glare skill feat, so we no longer have to worry about creatures not understanding our language. For level 2, I've gone with Witch's Armaments for Living Hair. This, of course, gives us a hair unarmed attack that deals 1d4 bludgeoning damage. But the damage this does isn't important. What is important is the traits that we get on the hair. The important traits here are the Disarm and Trip traits, as Disarm will allow us to lower the offenses of our targets, and tripping the opponent will make them off guard, which will go extremely well with our Evil Eye Hex. And for today's free archetype, we're going to be taking the Champion Dedication. This is a melee witch build, so we need as much defense as we can get. And we're certainly not going to get it from witch by itself. We need the heavy armor that the Champion Dedication will give us. And we will, of course, be taking other feats that will help us with our defenses. And taking the Tyrant Cause will allow us to debuff opponents even more. But we'll get into that later in this video. Of course, now it's time to talk about general feats since we're at level 3. We are, of course, going to need Canny Acumen for our reflex saves, toughness, and die hard. But shield block is going to be especially important for this build, and we're going to be slowed down by our armor, so we might as well take fleet to get a little more speed. At level 4, we'll be taking Sympathetic Strike. So when we hit with our hair, the target takes a -1 penalty on its saves against our hexes, or a -2 if we get a critical hit. I know the chances of us critically hitting are pretty low, but at least we get a -1 if we hit at all. This will make it easier for us to affect them with our Evil Eye Hex, and another hex we're going to take later. For our next free archetype feat, we're going to take Champion Resiliency. This will give us 3 extra hit points for every champion feat we take, as we are a witch, so we need as much hit points as we can get. Especially since sometimes we're going to be in melee. And before we get into the team report, of course, we gotta talk about 5th level ancestry feats. We're gonna take Precious Alloys. This turns our hair into cold iron or silver, allowing us to hit the weaknesses of certain creatures. For today's first teamwork report, you're going to have to be extremely careful at level 1. After all, we're a witch with no dex, and at that point, you won't have your armor yet, which means you are going to be very easily hit. So you're going to have to rely a lot on debuffs just to stay alive.
until you get to level 2. But you won't have your hair yet anyway, so you definitely do not want to go into melee at level 1. You're going to want to play this build in a party that has a tank, most definitely. Especially if you're only playing this at level 1. But the good news is that the occult list has some definite great debuff spells. You might also want to take Mystic Armor as one of your spells, just so you have a little more defense. But once you get that heavy armor, you won't really need it. That, however, does not mean you can't cast it on somebody else. Also, our intimidation is going to help, but it's not going to be hugely important until we get higher level, as we can use spells like Fear to get the Frightened condition. But overall, you can start going into melee at level 2, assuming you have free archetype. Unfortunately, this build really doesn't work very well without free archetype. At this point, you would just play it a little differently. You would just play this like any other witch. You would just use your hair when somebody walks up to you, and then get out of there as quick as possible. But you would have to be wary of those reactive strikes, or other reactions that grant attacks. As without the champion dedication, you are going to be incredibly easy to hit. Before we get into the rest of this build, it's time to talk about the sponsor of today's video, W Energy. I use this stuff all the time to help me with energy and focus that I need to keep bringing videos to you guys. And unlike other energy drinks, you're not going to find a bunch of junk in W Energy. W Energy gives you energy through natural B vitamins rather than things like sugar. And you guys get to use code TEAMGAMING for 10% off a starter pack. With it, you'll get this awesome shaker and 5 different flavors for you to try, including my favorite, strawberry lemonade. Link is in the description. At level 6, we'll take steady spellcasting, so our spells don't get disrupted while we're in melee. We're also going to need our champion's reaction. This, of course, will either let us knock foes prone, or make them take mental damage. We're also going to need Spirit Familiar, allowing us to deal good damage to enemies and heal our allies. And we need Shield Block because of Divine Ally Shields. This, of course, will increase the hardness of our shield by quite a bit. For our level 9 Ancestry feat, we're going to take Natural Magnetism. This allows us to cast Magnetic Attraction and Magnetic Repulsion once per day each, thus allowing us to push away certain enemies or pull them towards us, depending on the situation. Level 10 is time for Major Lesson to give us our second Hex. The Hex, of course, is Curse of Death. This allows us to do void damage to an enemy and fatigue them. And of course, if they happen to get to stage 4, they just die. Definitely isn't as good as other debuffs in this build, but it is something we can do. And the spell does good damage, so, there's that. We're also going to need Iron Repercussions. If the target of our Iron Command chooses not to fall prone, they're taking persistent mental damage now, rather than just mental damage. Thus, they're falling prone or taking damage every turn, which is pretty awesome. For level 12, we'll be taking Witch's Broom. This is a melee build, and while we are a witch and we can use spells on flying enemies, this will allow us to use our hair on flying enemies, thus making them more susceptible to our hexes, and allowing us to disarm them while they're in the air, and maybe even trip them so they fall out of the sky. And with Corrupted Shield, we can block damage as well as do it back to the attacker. Our level 13 Ancestry feat, we're going to be taking Spew Tentacles. This allows us to cast Black Tentacles once per day. And while we can cast Black Tentacles from our occult list, this is actually a better version of it for this build, because this allows us to grapple foes that have high reflex saves, and we can attack them with our hair while they're being grappled, without getting grappled by our own spell. Next is Rites of Transfiguration. This is essentially the new name for Baleful Polymorph, which is on the occult list. However, this feat allows us to replace one of our spells of 6th rank or higher with this spell. Thus, we never have to repair it. As long as we've got 10 minutes, we can always have this spell ready to go. And diverse armor experts will give us expert in our heavy armor, which is very important. Next, we're going to need Hex Focus to get our focus points back quicker. And Quick Shield Block will give us an extra reaction just for shield block. So we can always shield block even if we use a reaction for a spell or something else. Assuming, of course, that we raise our shields. For this build's last ancestry feat, I went with Augment Senses. We can spend one action so we can no longer be flanked, and when we seek for creatures, we can do so in a 60-foot cone or 30-foot burst instead of the normal area. And if we're searching for objects, we can do so in a 15-foot square instead of the normal area. The big thing here is using an action so we can no longer be flanked. Again, we need as much defensive options as we can get. Next at level 18, we'll be taking Split Hex, allowing us to hit 2 creatures with Evil Eye or Curse of Death. And we'll also need Aura of Despair to keep enemies frightened when they're near us. For level 20, we're going to take Patron's Claim. Not only does this allow us to get back a focus point, but it also lets us do good damage and drain the targets, which means lowering their HP and their fortitude saves, which is definitely a big deal as a lot of enemies have high fortitude saving throws. And our last feat for this build is going to be Second Ally. We want to pick up the Blade Ally for this so we can get the Fearsome rune on our hair, so that if we do manage to get a critical hit, we can frighten a foe without spending a spell slot or having to make an intimidation check. For Teamwork Report number 2, now we actually have pretty good defense. I mean, we're expert in heavy armor, and we can shield block twice if we want. If you don't have free archetype, then Witch's Broom is going to be even more important because that'll take you out of range of most melee enemies. But if you don't have free archetypes, you might also take an extending rune for your hand wraps of Mighty Blows, as that will allow you to hit with your hair from up to 60 feet away. Granted, you won't be able to trip or disarm with that, but at least the enemies you hit will get a -1 on their saves against your hexes. But if you do have free archetype, then Aura of Despair and Spew Tentacles is an awesome combination. As remember, with Spew Tentacles, we don't get grabbed by our black tentacles. But enemies do, and that keeps them within 15 feet of us, allowing our Aura of Despair to keep them frightened. Overall, this build is not about doing damage. At least not very much of it. It's our job to debuff foes so that our allies that are focused on damage have an easier time doing it. But that's going to do it for this build. I want to thank Daniel Landis for becoming a team manager, as well as Underhill for being a channel member. If you guys want me to build your specific build, check out the Patreon page in the description below. Or if you want a War Priest Cleric build, you can check out this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.